The Roki Sasaki sweepstakes are officially over, and of course, the Seattle Mariners missed out. So, what do the Mariners do from here? Is there still a possibility they trade one of their starting pitchers? And does it make sense for them to go out there and look to add another starting pitcher? Obviously, with Roki Sasaki being off the table now, probably the best starter that was available, the Mariners find themselves in an interesting spot where maybe trading Luis Castillo felt like an option before is no longer as much of an option. And because of that, the Mariners are going to have to get real interesting with the way they try to build this roster the rest of the way. Joe, since the Mariners did miss out on Roki Sasaki, do you see them trading a starting pitcher still? Do you think that Luis Castillo could still be off this team? Or do you think at this point they just roll with the starting five they have?
During the live stream that I did where for Donovan Solano signing, we got news of the pass and bomb that was basically outlining the final three. And there were questions being posed about, well, if any of those teams that didn't end up with Sasaki, should they turn to the Mariners as a potential trade fit for one of the Mariners starting pitchers? And I was kind of like going back and forth with chat saying like, I don't know if it's necessarily like the same thing, because signing Roki Sasaki and trading for Luis Castillo are completely different animals, because Sasaki is much cheaper, he's younger, whatever, cost controlled in that sense. Obviously, he's a better arm talent. But for Castillo, he's owed over $20 million. He's got a contract where he is owed over $20 million for the next, 2-3 years? With it, like, there's a vesting option in there. Like, it's a lot more, I won't say convoluted, but it's just a lot harder to kind of navigate those trade paths with teams that were in the Roki sweepstakes, because those teams that were in there probably weren't looking at Castillo regardless, given the price tag. So I think the avenue is still looking at the teams that, were interested in Castillo beforehand. And maybe there's a couple that are like in the middle part of the Venn diagram here. Like maybe the Red Sox were interested in Roki, but they didn't get that far with him. And maybe they revisit those trade talks with Castillo. Ultimately, the Mariners missing out on Roki, I don't think it should come as much of a surprise necessarily, but trading from the starting five, I still think it's an option. And with the money that they clear by trading Castillo, because they're not trading one of the other four, I severely doubt that if they do make a trade from the starting rotation, that it would be anybody not named Luis Castillo.
Yeah, and I think that with the Roki sweepstakes finally coming to an end, it does open the avenues, like you mentioned there. You made a really good point. All those teams that did miss out on Roki, like maybe they were waiting to see if they were going to sign Roki Sasaki, and now that they didn't, maybe they're getting a little bit more desperate, because obviously we're less than a couple weeks away from pitchers and catchers reporting. Like teams are like, oh crap, we got to get this rotation figured out. We got to, have our roster nailed down. They might be more willing to give up certain guys in trades that they weren't prior in the Luis Castillo sweepstakes. And as the starting pitcher field narrows down in free agency, maybe Luis Castillo starts to look a little bit more enticing. We saw Justin Verlander get $15 million. He's not worth that. Whereas Luis Castillo making $22 million, he's worth that. He's worth that based on today's market. He'd probably make closer to 27 to 28 on the market today if he was to be a free agent right now. And so I think that, I think it's still definitely a viable option for the Mariners to trade Luis Castillo. The hard part is then you are one of the teams looking for a starting pitcher. For the Mariners, the nice part is they are one of the best rotations in all of baseball. And because of that, they can afford to maybe take a little bit of a hit to the rotation while still finding a way to make this offense better, to augment this offense. And we've talked so much about all the different trade avenues for Luis Castillo this offseason, so I don't want to go too far into it here. Mm-hmm. But I think that, teams we've talked about before, like maybe the Cardinals or the Orioles, maybe.
I would say the Orioles more so than the Cardinals. I don't think Castillo makes a lot of sense on the Cardinals.
That's a good point.
Because they're not interested in competing this year. Sure, they'll have Castillo for another year, like they'll have him for years beyond that. But paying someone that much money, like they want to get out from underneath a lot of the money that they're already owed to some of their starting pitchers. So I don't think the Cardinals. I would turn towards the Orioles as like the main kind of like benefactor of being interested in terms of like the Castillo trade talks. And Jordan Schusterman on Ben Ranieri's Substack, the C-Level Substack, talking about trades for pitchers don't necessarily have to happen like early in the offseason. They can happen way, way late. Like Dylan Cease to the Padres happened very, very late last year. And it's because certain guys get injured. Arm injuries happen as soon as you get to spring training. A pitcher on a team that's competitive might blow their arm out and be like, oh my God, we're in trouble. Hi, Mariners. Are you still interested in trading Luis Castillo? And then they become desperate. And then you can, how you're saying, they might be interested in trading players that they weren't before, now because they actually need Luis Castillo, as opposed to it was more of like a luxury to get a pitcher of his caliber. Same thing can be said, and Jordan made this point, same thing can be said about the Mariners. The moment there's an arm injury and you've traded Luis Castillo, SOL, good luck. Hopefully Logan Evans is as good as we've tried to make him out to be. Or hopefully whoever you signed in free agency to replace Luis Castillo with the money that you saved, because I think that'd be the avenue that they go. They wouldn't probably get a pitcher back in the Castillo trade. I think they'd probably get batters and then sign a starting pitcher in free agency who could be just to a 1-year deal. It could be for a short-term deal. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything lucrative, anything crazy like Robbie Ray's 5-year, 110, whatever. It can be Jack Flaherty for 1 year, 13, however much he's going to cost, because that's all you need him for. That's like realistically. And I don't think that's necessarily like a huge step back as far as rotation, like dominance is concerned, because adding anybody who can pitch relatively well in high volume situations, adding them to T-Mobile Park, giving them half their starts in T-Mobile Park every single year is only going to benefit them in the long term. So like teams be wary of arm injuries, and Mariners fans, if you're still like, oh, they're going to probably keep Castillo. The moment you see an arm injury for a competitive team, that team should immediately jump on your radar as like, they're probably calling about Castillo.
I think that's a great point. And I think that the Mariners are kind of the beneficiaries of all of this. Yes, again, missing out on Roki sucks. Obviously, I was hoping he'd be a Mariner all offseason, because that makes this offseason so much easier. But the Mariners, with them waiting this long to trade Luis Castillo, or them waiting this long to really make some of the moves. I mean, obviously, Solano was the first real move of the offseason we saw last week or whatever it was, a couple weeks ago. I think that for the Mariners waiting until spring training, to make sure that they don't have an injury that they need to have Luis Castillo for. So let's say Brian Wu gets hurt in spring training. Thank God you didn't trade Luis Castillo, because otherwise you'd be screwed. Now you have Emerson Hancock or Logan Evans or whoever it may be filling in for Brian Wu again. Okay, whatever. That's doable. But if you traded Luis Castillo and then somebody gets hurt, you're like you mentioned, you're screwed. And so the Mariners are the beneficiary in that regard. However, the con side of it, I think, is that you could be rolling into spring training with a roster that's maybe 60% built.
Yeah.
Because your offense is consisting of guys like Ryan Bliss and, Mitch Haniger still on your team, Mitch Garver, etc. There's definitely a fine line between the two, and I don't necessarily know which side the Mariners really want to toe right now. But what Jordan said is a really good point, where the Mariners could become huge beneficiaries of this if somebody does end up getting injured. For that reason, Joe, do you foresee, before we get to pitchers and catchers, do you foresee him being traded at all? Or do you assume that it happens during spring training, if it happens at all?
I think giving Jordan like a little bit of an ego boost and laying into that foresight a bit, I think after. Because it makes a lot of sense. And they'd have to get blown away by a trade package, because we've seen things that they've turned down, like Cassis and Yoshida for Castillo. I feel like a lot of teams that need offensive help probably would look at that and be like, yeah, I think that's fair. Like, sure, Yoshida doesn't do a whole lot defensively. He doesn't really do a whole lot other than hit 280, right? That's pretty much what he's known for, and get paid $18 million. What?
Donovan Solano?
Oh my God. He does that, but for $13 or $14 million less. That's crazy. And then Tristan Cassis, obviously a lot of control, a lot of like potential there. I think teams that, I mean, the thing with that trade specifically is like the money is the problem, where if the Mariners didn't care about money, one, they wouldn't have to make that trade because they could sign free agents. But two, if they did go through with that trade, the money that you're paying Yoshida doesn't really matter. Like you'd be saving like a little bit of money, but not like a lot, which is what they're going for. Is they're trying to save a lot of money in this trade, more than likely, so that way they can do something else with the team afterwards. So I still firmly believe that it would be after pitchers and catchers. And the only way it happens beforehand is if they get, someone approaches them with an offer that they cannot refuse.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a team that may be desperate enough to do that missed out on Roki Sasaki is the New York Mets. That's a team that was looking to add Roki, a team that I think was kind of banking on the fact that they could add Roki to a rotation that already features guys like Kodai Senga. And they missed out. So now do they move to go get someone like Luis Castillo to make sure that they are one of the top teams in the National League? Because obviously we know how good the Mets were in the playoffs in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think adding Luis Castillo to an already pretty solid rotation, the Mets make a lot of sense for the Mariners to go out and make a trade with. Again, obviously they already went out and got Juan Soto, so that's a big move there. It really depends on what happens with Pete Alonso. But I think that for the Mets, they're a team that could become desperate enough to make a trade for Luis Castillo in the near future. Is it going to be Mark Vientos? Probably not. But I don't necessarily know who else on that team that I would really want other than Mark Vientos. I think that if I'm the Mariners, I'm holding out. And if you want Castillo, you're trading me Vientos or you're not getting Castillo, sort of a deal. But I think that teams like that, like the Mets, teams that were really thought to have a good chance at signing Roki Sasaki, could now look to the Mariners and Luis Castillo and say, hey, that's a guy that we just need to go get now as our fallback option. I think worst case scenario for the Mariners is they go into the season with a 60% baked lineup, right? But then maybe, hopefully towards the middle of the season, maybe another guy's come up, like Logan Evans has come up, and he has looked great. Or Brandon Garcia has looked great as a reliever, and they want to move him back to a starter or something like that. Could you trade Luis Castillo at the trade deadline? Because starting pitchers are very valuable during the trade deadline, specifically as teams are looking at trying to make their way into the playoffs. So, yeah, I think holding on to Castillo is a good idea up until at least the middle of spring training to really get a firm idea of who is going to be looking for starting pitching. I think Luis Castillo is one of the most valuable commodities on the market, and it's just a matter of time before the Mariners do decide to make a move on him.
I can't believe you just suggested the Mariners to 2024 Tigers their trade deadline. They're going to trade Castillo at the deadline like the Tigers traded Jack Flaherty, and then they're going to go on a run of their lifetimes in the second half and make the playoffs.
They're going to trade Luis Castillo to the Tigers. For Jace Jung.
I think we're dreaming a little bit, but
in the end, the Mariners did miss out on Roki Sasaki, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens with Luis Castillo like we have been all offseason. We appreciate you guys watching this one, and go Mariners.